What if Napoleon had won the war against Russia? Welcome to a place where history takes a different path, where each video plunges you into fascinating alternative realities. Today, imagine a world where Napoleon did not experience the disaster of the Russian campaign, where instead of pushing all the way to Moscow, he changes strategy and forces Alexander I to capitulate. Would he have reshaped Europe for centuries, completely crushed England? Would we have known a Franco-Russian empire dominating the world? Between epic battles, political maneuvers, and imperial ambitions, let's dive together into this alternate history and discover what history could have become if Napoleon had triumphed in Russia. But before embarking on this new adventure, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a thing. Thank you and enjoy the journey. At the turn of the 18th century, Europe is a continent dominated by powerful absolute monarchies, a system of government in which the sovereign holds all or almost all executive, legislative, and judicial powers. The various kings and emperors often rule without challenge and surround themselves with lavish courts, symbolizing their power, but sometimes concealing deep social inequalities. In France, the absolute monarchy presents itself around the figure of King Louis XVI, successor of Louis XV, both from the Bourbon dynasty. The king resides in the sumptuous palace of Versailles, a few kilometers west of Paris. This estate, erected as a true symbol of royal power, houses a large court comprised of nobles attached to hereditary offices and privileges. The king has theoretical authority over all aspects of kingdom life. However, in practice, internal rivalries between ministers, courtiers, and great officers often test the efficiency of royal governance. As the French population grows, estimated to approach 28 million inhabitants in 1789, the imbalances become glaring. The distribution of land, wealth, and taxes weighs heavily on the Third Estate, comprising the majority of the population: bourgeois, artisans, peasants, and small traders. Privileged categories, such as the nobility and clergy, benefit from tax exemptions or numerous legal and social advantages, creating a climate of increasingly palpable injustice. This situation, however, is not unique to France. In the Habsburg monarchy of Austria, led at the end of the 18th century by Emperor Joseph II, there are attempts at so-called enlightened reforms. Joseph II indeed tries to soften the conditions of serfdom or reorganize taxation, but faces fierce resistance from the nobility and part of the clergy, reluctant to abandon their privileges. In Prussia, the Hohenzollern dynasty, notably embodied by Frederick II, has initiated military and administrative reforms marked by more efficient public affairs management, but power remains largely centralized around the royal figure. The Prussian nobility, called Junkers, retains essential control over the land and heavily influences political life. As for Russia, then led by Empress Catherine II, it remains an autocratic regime where the Tsar or Tsarina is considered God's representative on earth. The powerful and proud Russian nobility controls vast agricultural domains, exploiting serfs tied to the land and deprived of rights. Despite the intellectual outreach that Catherine II boasts by courting Enlightenment philosophers, the harshness of the Russian social order persists in the background. Beyond continental Europe, the late 18th century is also marked by rivalry between maritime and colonial powers, fiercely competing to control trade routes and resources from overseas. At their head is the United Kingdom, whose fleet imposes almost uncontested naval supremacy. London, the kingdom's capital, sees goods from India, Africa, or North America transit, making England one of the main commercial hubs of the time. Exposure to exotic goods, tea, spices, silks, and capital accumulation will favor the first industrial revolution, already nascent in England on the eve of 1800. Spain, for its part, has since the 16th century constituted a vast empire in Latin America, encompassing immense territories like New Spain, present-day Mexico, and Peru. However, this imperial colossus is gradually weakened by a burdensome bureaucracy and an economy overly reliant on the extraction of gold and silver. Over the course of the 18th century, Spain sees its economy stagnate, and its declining influence leaves the field open for the rise of England and France. Portugal, a traditional ally of England, continues to exploit Brazil with its gold mines and sugarcane plantations. Yet, it also encounters economic and administrative difficulties that limit its prosperity. The United Provinces, that is, the Netherlands, remain a notable commercial power, even if their political prestige has waned compared to previous centuries. Dutch trade is still flourishing. The Dutch East India Company sends ships to Asia to bring back spices, textiles, and other luxury goods highly valued in Europe. Amsterdam remains one of the largest financial centers on the continent, where stocks and merchant titles are exchanged. However, competition from London is becoming increasingly fierce, and successive wars have weakened Dutch institutions. Beyond mere economic competition, an intellectual fervor, known as the Enlightenment, is blossoming all over Europe. This period, which roughly spans from the late 17th century to the late 18th century, is marked by the exaltation of reason, critical thinking, and the desire to examine political and social structures to penetrate their foundations. Montesquieu, for example, advocates the separation of powers in his work, The Spirit of the Laws from 1748. Rousseau puts forth the idea of a social contract, where sovereignty belongs to the people, fundamentally challenging royal absolutism. These writings circulate in the form of printed books, pamphlets, or discussions in those famous salons mentioned earlier. They exert a real influence on the enlightened minds of the era. Meanwhile, the young American Republic, born in 1776 after the Declaration of Independence and the war against Great Britain, represents for some Europeans a possible model of political emancipation. The idea that a people could free themselves from an old metropolis, establish republican institutions, and found a state on principles of liberty and equality, at least as they are stated, since the reality remains complex, especially with the existence of slavery in the American colonies, captures imaginations. Pamphlets recounting the American Revolution circulate in Europe and inspire reformers who dream of shaking up the Ancien Regime, notably in France. In Russia, Empress Catherine II has these French philosophers translated, theoretically admiring the principles of the Enlightenment while maintaining an autocratic regime. Her internal reforms are limited by the refusal of Russian nobles to lose their privileges. It is said that in her private salon, Catherine sometimes received scholars or Western thinkers. She offered them a warm welcome, sought their advice on legislation, justice, or education, but never consented to weaken the absolute authority of the throne. Thus, one sees the ambiguity of Europe at the end of the 18th century. On the one hand, kings and queens call themselves enlightened or friends of the arts and letters. On the other, they are deeply afraid that these subversive ideas will awaken in their peoples a desire for revolt. Here we are in 1789. The accumulated tensions within French society are about to explode. King Louis XVI, facing a severe financial crisis caused by costly wars and an unfair tax system, resolves to convene the Estates General, an assembly that brings together representatives of the three orders, the clergy, the nobility, and the Third Estate. The delegates of the Third Estate, aware of their unity, refused to follow the old voting rules by order, which favored the two privileged orders. Quickly, they proclaim themselves the National Assembly and intend to draft a constitution. A few weeks later, on July 14, 1789, Parisian rioters stormed the Bastille, a royal fortress where munitions are stored. More symbolically, the Bastille embodies the king's arbitrary power. Its fall is a resounding event. It signals a reversal of monarchical authority. Following this, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, adopted on August 26, 1789, by the Assembly, sets out unprecedented principles such as individual freedom, equality before the law, and the sovereignty of the nation. This shockwave concerns not only France. Across Europe, sovereigns observe the situation with concern. The news of a popular and radical revolution frightens the courts of Vienna, Austria, Berlin, Prussia, and St. Petersburg, Russia. The privileges of the nobility appear threatened, and many French aristocratic families, fearing the turn the revolution is taking, choose exile. They often go to neighboring countries in Germany or Italy. This massive emigration also affects the Navy and the Army, where many noble officers leave France, sometimes leaving behind disorganized regiments. In this period of uncertainty, the King of Sweden, Gustav III, shows particular curiosity about the developments of the revolution. A reformist sovereign, he had already sought to strengthen his own power in his country, diminishing the influence of the Swedish aristocracy. Seeing France in turmoil, Gustav III supposedly asked his ambassadors for letters and pamphlets detailing the debates taking place in Paris. He hoped to draw from these revolutionary ideas the elements for modernizing Sweden while keeping his royal title. Unfortunately for him, the subsequent French events, far more radical than he imagined, left him perplexed. He concluded that the questioning of the monarchy could quickly escalate and undermine the established order. His own reign ended tragically in 1792, when he was assassinated at a masked ball. Faced with the turn taken by the revolution, several European powers decide to intervene, either to quietly support the French émigrés or to try to counter a possible revolutionary contagion on their own territories. Austria and Prussia, hostile to this democratic momentum, form alliances to prepare for military action. They are particularly worried about the fate of Queen Marie Antoinette, who, it should be remembered, is an Archduchess of Austria by birth and sister of Emperor Joseph II, then Leopold II. The prospect of seeing the French royal family deposed or threatened shocks European sovereigns who fear for their own legitimacy. Conflicts break out very quickly. Revolutionary France, determined to defend its gains, finds itself at war with Austria and Prussia as early as 1792. The advantages of the new French army are not obvious at first, as a portion of the royal officers have emigrated. Nevertheless, the enthusiasm of the volunteers and the patriotic fervor, fueled by the idea of defending freedom, give the nascent republic considerable momentum. The most striking example is the victory at Valmy on September 20th, 1792, where the Revolutionary Army repels the Prussians, strengthening the determination of the sans-culottes soldiers and deeply troubling the perception of old Europe regarding the potential power of a citizen army. According to some accounts from the time, the Austrian soldiers, shocked to see the French fighting in pants rather than breeches, disdainfully nicknamed them sans-culottes. Little did they know that this nickname would become a symbol of pride for the supporters of the revolution, symbolizing a rejection of the ancien régime and noble or aristocratic attire. These sans-culottes saw themselves as citizen soldiers, distinguished by their courage and dedication to the revolutionary cause. The mocking reaction of the Austrians, instead of demoralizing the French, helped to further unite the volunteers around the idea that they were fighting for liberty and equality against forces hostile to change. Gradually, other states joined the coalition against revolutionary France, notably Great Britain, Spain, and the Italian states. These coalitions, occurring from 1792 to 1797, led to major confrontations, whether on the Rhine, in northern Italy, or along the maritime coasts. Through the battles, France quickly learned to militarize. Men were enlisted en masse. The production of cannons, rifles, and gunpowder increased in public factories, and a keen sense of national defense emerged. Capable and daring generals stood out, creating a pool of talented military leaders who would soon make history under the leadership of a certain Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon Bonaparte was born on August 15, 1769, in Ajaccio, on the island of Corsica, a territory that had only just been annexed to France in 1768. His family, of minor local nobility, belonged to the Corsican bourgeoisie. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, held official functions with the French administration, while his mother, Letitia Ramolino, diligently oversaw the strict education of her many children. Early on, young Napoleon displayed a determined, sometimes fiery character and showed a thirst for knowledge. His first steps in the French army began at the college in Autun, and then at the military school of Brienne, where he studied from 1779 to 1784. There, he was noted for his seriousness and his aptitude in mathematics, essential for artillery, which would later ensure his rapid promotions. In 1785, at just 16 years old, Napoleon became a second lieutenant in an artillery regiment. He greatly benefited from this period to refine his understanding of France's military and political operations. Coming from a modest background for the era, he did not have the same ease as other officers, who were mostly noble by birth. But he compensated with great ambition and an extraordinary sense of strategy. There was already a noted fascination in him for the writings of Enlightenment philosophers like Rousseau and Voltaire, who influenced his political thinking. Nevertheless, the French Revolution of 1789 would completely change his destiny. The monarchy collapsed, the army was reorganized, and numerous positions of authority opened up to those who could prove their loyalty to revolutionary France. When Republican France was confronted with foreign coalitions, Napoleon saw an opportunity to distinguish himself. He fully committed to defending revolutionary ideals, knowing that a brilliant career awaited him if he proved worthy. In 1793, he participated in the reconquest of the city of Toulon, which had fallen under British control. His talent as an artilleryman, coupled with his determination, impressed the Committee of Public Safety. This was Bonaparte's first major feat of arms. He obtained the rank of brigadier general at just 24 years old. Many were astonished by this rapid promotion, but the circumstances of war and the revolutionary government's desire to encourage deserving young officers favored his rise. Napoleon's prestige grew rapidly, which earned him the position of head of the Army of Italy in 1796, as France sought to weaken Austria in the northern Italian peninsula. At 26, the young general embarked on an extensive offensive campaign. The victories that followed, notably at Montenotte, April 12, 1796, and Lodi, May 10, 1796, galvanized his soldiers. He modernized the way of waging war, favoring rapid movements and the element of surprise, while making the most of the topography. This series of successes between 1796 and 1797 then subjugated several Italian principalities, even forcing Austria to sign a preliminary peace, Treaty of Leoben, April 1797, before the definitive Treaty of Campo Formio, October 17, 1797. Revolutionary France, victorious on this front, saw Napoleon as a future national hero. On his side, he gained an immense aura among his men, who were already nicknaming him the Little Corporal, a sign of affection and respect. Emboldened by his renown, Napoleon turned towards a new adventure, the Egyptian campaign, between 1798 and 1799. The idea stemmed as much from a desire to threaten British possessions in the East as from intellectual curiosity. Egypt, then an Ottoman province, sparked the interest of the French scholars sent to study this ancient civilization. When Napoleon landed in Alexandria in July 1798, he quickly won some battles against local troops, including the famous Battle of the Pyramids on July 21, 1798. Militarily, however, the shadow of the powerful British fleet loomed. On August 1, 1798, during the naval battle of Aboukir, Admiral Nelson sank most of the French fleet, isolating Napoleon's troops in Egypt. This was a major strategic setback. The French army, cut off from the mainland, found itself stranded on Egyptian soil. Despite this blow, the campaign produced a significant scientific result, the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, which occurred in July 1799. This stele, with multiple inscriptions, would later enable Jean-François Champollion to decipher the hieroglyphs, paving the way for modern Egyptology. Amid this rather tumultuous Oriental episode, a singular anecdote circulated among the officers. Napoleon was said to have fallen under the charm of a young crocodile captured by the French soldiers in the Nile. Fascinated by the strangeness of the animal, he reportedly ordered it to be brought back to France for precise study. The conditions of transport, a reptile amid military convoys, were a subject of jest. While the story has sometimes been exaggerated, it aptly illustrates Bonaparte's insatiable curiosity, eager to bring back unusual or unknown items to Europe. Despite the difficulties encountered in Egypt, Napoleon sensed the winds shifting in France. The Directory in Paris was increasingly unpopular. Defeats at the borders threatened to weaken the Republic. In August 1799, he decided to discreetly leave Egypt to return to the mainland, leaving command to the generals remaining on site. Upon his arrival, he realized that the moment was ripe for a coup. He still enjoyed great prestige with both the army and the people, weary of the repeated failures of the Directory regime. Thus, on November 9, 1799, the coup d'état took place, overthrowing the Directory. The assembly was compelled, under pressure from troops loyal to Bonaparte, to establish a new government, the consulate. Napoleon became first consul, thus instituting an authoritarian regime, but one more stable than the previous chaos. At 30, he was now the strongman of France. From then on, he set about thoroughly reorganizing the institutions and consolidating his power. The consulate, proclaimed in 1799, marked a turning point in post-revolutionary French history. The country, exhausted after a decade of turmoil, longed for order and stability. Napoleon Bonaparte understood this well. He devoted his initial years in government to preparing internal reforms of considerable scope. Having become first consul for life in 1802, he gradually consolidated his legitimacy, presenting himself as the guarantor of the fundamental principles of the revolution, equality before the law, while developing a very marked personal power. On the economic front, Napoleon established the Bank of France in 1800. This institution, intended to regulate currency and support credit, quickly became a pillar of French prosperity. After inflation and bankruptcies plagued the revolutionary period, the restored monetary stability provided relief for both the bourgeoisie and the common people. The Bank of France, partially controlled by the state, also symbolized Bonaparte's intent to return to a form of dirigisme. The state set out the major financial directions to strengthen the country against international challenges. Among the most enduring achievements of the consulate is also the drafting of the Civil Code, completed in 1804. As a synthesis of customary law and revolutionary principles, this text laid the foundations of modern law: equality before the law, contractual freedom, and partial secularization of civil status. By ensuring the security of property and individuals, it bolstered the confidence of the middle classes, who saw in this code the guarantee of their revolutionary gains. To this day, the profound influence of this Napoleonic Code is recognized in many European and other legal systems. The religious question, explosive since the Revolution, was also the subject of a compromise under the consulate. By signing the Concordat with Pope Pius VII in 1801, Napoleon restored a semblance of peace between the Catholic Church and the French state, while maintaining a form of state control over the clergy. Priests regained their place in society, but had to swear an oath of fidelity to the state. This gesture reassured much of the population, attached to Catholicism, after years of religious persecution and anti-clerical policies. There is also an anecdote indicative of Napoleon's meticulous character. During the drafting of numerous legal articles under the consulate, the future emperor would sometimes reread and correct drafts late into the night. He is described, quill in hand, lit by candlelight, constantly asking his advisors for details. This attention to detail helped to build the legend of a tireless head of state, always ready to perfect the institutional structure. On the international scene, Napoleon sought to give France some respite. He knew that the country, weary from 10 years of war, needed a break, if only temporarily. The Peace of Amiens, signed in 1802 with England, was thus a truce. It was a fragile peace, as both powers were wary of each other. France, undergoing reorganization, and the United Kingdom, at the helm of a formidable fleet and vast colonial empire. This suspension of hostilities was enthusiastically welcomed by many French people who hoped for a more stable future. The consulate was a transitional regime. Napoleon saw grander ambitions. Aware of his popularity and central role in French politics, he had himself proclaimed Emperor of the French on December 2, 1804. The ceremony, organized at Notre Dame de Paris, was of unprecedented splendor since the fall of the monarchy. Pope Pius VII was present to bless the new sovereign, but Napoleon crowned himself, placing the imperial crown on his head before crowning Empress Josephine. This gesture symbolized a complete break with the old divine right monarchy. The emperor wanted to affirm that his power stemmed primarily from his own victories and the French people. Upon being crowned, he faced the Third Coalition, which included England, Austria, and Russia. The most famous victory of this period was undoubtedly the Battle of Austerlitz on December 2, 1805, exactly 1 year after his coronation. This confrontation, called the Battle of the Three Emperors, involved Napoleon, Franz II, the Emperor of Austria, and Alexander I, the Tsar of Russia. The French maneuvers, perfectly orchestrated, deceived the enemy, who initially believed they could encircle the Grande Armée. In reality, Napoleon lured his opponents onto the Pratzen Plateau to then overwhelm them. The Austro-Russian forces suffered a crushing defeat, leading to the signing of the Peace of Pressburg on December 26, 1805. Austria lost even more territory and influence in Central Europe. In the wake of these successes, Napoleon reorganizes the political map of Germany. He definitively dissolves the Holy Roman Empire in 1806 and establishes the Confederation of the Rhine, a group of German states under his protection. This vassalized confederation serves as a buffer against potential assaults from Austria or Prussia. The old medieval order, symbolized by Emperor Francis II, is now swept away, and Central Europe finds itself under the sway of a new order imposed by French arms. However, the emperor soon encounters fierce opposition, that of Prussia, traditionalist and jealous of its influence in Germany. In 1806, this rivalry erupts with force. The battles of Jena and Auerstedt, fought on the same day, October 14, 1806, on two neighboring fields, deal Prussia a resounding defeat. In a single campaign, the Prussian military power, reputedly formidable since Frederick II, is humiliated and forced to surrender. Napoleon makes a triumphant entry into Berlin, where he dictates his conditions. For the emperor, however, this victory is only a step, as Imperial Russia, led by Alexander I, remains determined not to let France dominate Eastern Europe. Indeed, the two protagonists clash in Poland during the winter campaign of 1806-1807. The weather conditions are harsh, heavy snow and almost impassable roads. After the battles of Eylau, February 7-8, 1807, and Friedland, the adversaries measure their strength. The Battle of Eylau, in particular, leaves a mark. This fierce struggle does not bring a clear victory and plunges the Grande Armée into difficulty. The cold, significant losses, and the harsh realities of war in the East weigh on the French soldiers. It is reported that in Eylau, chilled by the ice, several French officers cut pieces from uniforms taken from enemy corpses to protect themselves from the icy wind. The image is striking. It illustrates the brutality of the clashes and the men's determination, ready to do anything to survive in this winter hell. The Battle of Friedland, on the other hand, turns to Napoleon's advantage. On June 14, 1807, he deals the Russians a decisive defeat that forces them to negotiate. Alexander III resolves to discuss a peace treaty and a division of influence, anxious to preserve his empire from total collapse. Thus, the Treaty of Tilsit is signed in July 1807 on the Niemen River. Napoleon and Alexander III meet there on a raft, converted into a conference room, a highly symbolic gesture showing the two emperors deciding Europe's fate. By this agreement, Russia commits to respecting the continental blockade decreed by Napoleon against British trade, while a formal Franco-Russian alliance is established. The Polish territories are partially reorganized into a Grand Duchy of Warsaw under Napoleon's tutelage. For his part, Alexander III retains his vast empire and hopes to preserve his interests in the Balkans and the Orient. The conclusion of the Treaty of Tilsit represents for many the pinnacle of Napoleonic domination over the continent. Great Britain, more isolated than ever, remains the last great power to contest the supremacy of Imperial France. But for now, Napoleon, crowned with success, stands at the height of his glory, having successively defeated Austria, Prussia, and forced Russia into an alliance. However, he is unaware that in seeking to impose his views on all of Europe, he exposes himself to new contradictions and conflicts that will resurface in the years to come. For now, the new master of the continent enjoys his success, consolidating his internal reforms and savoring the prestige conferred by his triumphant campaigns. The principle of the Continental Blockade, decreed in 1806 and reinforced after Tilsit, consists of closing all ports and continental European markets to British products. Napoleon is convinced that by depriving Great Britain of commercial outlets, he will weaken it enough to force it to negotiate peace, or, at best, place it in a secondary position. At that time, the United Kingdom indeed represents the world's foremost naval power and a major center of transoceanic trade. Its colonial empire and immense merchant fleet ensure its wealth. For Napoleon, isolating England also means asserting French supremacy on the continent. However, the economic consequences of this blockade are considerable for European populations. Sugar, coffee, and many other exotic products become rare and expensive. The French colonies, much less developed than those of Great Britain, cannot compensate for the loss of these goods. Moreover, many European territories relied on international trade and suddenly find themselves cut off from a significant portion of their clientele. Dutch merchants, for example, lose their maritime exchanges with London, and the Venetians, under Napoleonic domination, no longer have access to the Adriatic Sea in the same way as before. One of the major consequences of the blockade is the rise of smuggling. English and European merchants circumvent the prohibitions by using less controlled ports or regions difficult to monitor. In Spain and the Mediterranean, fraud is organized on a large scale. Indeed, Spain, under French supervision after 1808, remains a peninsula open to the Atlantic. Some ports, sometimes supported by the British Royal Navy, continue to clandestinely transit cotton, coffee, or even sugar from the Caribbean. Napoleon's customs officers, although zealous, struggle to control all the coasts and land passages. This situation benefits traffickers, who rapidly become enriched. If the Continental Blockade was initially meant to economically suffocate the United Kingdom, it also causes tensions throughout Europe. States that wish to maintain good trade relations with London are forced to choose a side under penalty of facing Napoleon's wrath. This is particularly true for Portugal, historically allied with Great Britain. However, Portugal benefits from the revenues of its Brazilian colony, which provides it with many exotic resources and a privileged access to maritime trade. By refusing to apply the blockade, it finds itself at odds with the Emperor of the French. In 1807, Napoleon launched an expedition to force Portugal to close its ports to the English. The French army, accompanied by Spanish troops, since Spain was then, at least officially, an ally of France, crosses the Iberian Peninsula. But very quickly, the situation becomes complicated. In 1808, Napoleon decides to depose the King of Spain and place his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the throne. This clumsy intervention in the internal affairs of Spain arouses fierce popular resistance, supported by the British, who see it as the perfect opportunity to combat France on the continent. Thus begins the Spanish War, later known as the Spanish Quagmire. Spain, vast and mountainous, proves very difficult to control. The French armies, well trained for pitched battles, become bogged down in a guerrilla-type conflict. Small Spanish units, aided by peasants and volunteers, attack French convoys, cut communication lines, and then retreat into villages. This situation exhausts the Grand Army, which must continually provide reinforcements. Many soldiers, far from France, poorly supplied and faced with the hostility of the local population, lose confidence. Insurrections multiply, forcing Napoleon to remain attentive to the Iberian situation. The intervention in Portugal causes the flight of the Portuguese royal family, which goes into exile in Rio de Janeiro in 1807. This Brazilian city then becomes the capital of the Portuguese Empire, an absolutely unprecedented situation in Europe. For the first time, a European kingdom is administered from its overseas territory. This demonstrates Napoleon's capacity to disrupt the traditional order, but also the growing importance of global geopolitics. The Iberian Peninsula is now a major theater of conflict, where France and Great Britain vie for influence. While Napoleon is managing his conflict in Spain, he must maintain a precarious balance with Russia. Since the signing of the Treaty of Tilsit in July 1807, Alexander I is officially the ally of the Emperor of the French. This alliance requires Russia to close its ports and cease all trade with Great Britain. However, the Russian nobility, as well as the merchants, feel this choice harshly. Russian grain exports to the British Isles were lucrative, and many aristocrats obtained luxury goods through maritime routes linking the Baltic Sea to England. Diplomatic and economic pressures are multiplying in St. Petersburg. Tsar Alexander must face criticism from his advisors, who believe that Russia is losing more than it gains by remaining in the French orbit. By 1811, the discord between France and Russia becomes more evident. Tsar Alexander I, aware of the importance of Great Britain as a trading partner, increases secret contacts with London. Russian diplomats seek to find a compromise to bypass or relax the blockade. Meanwhile, Napoleon continues to support the Poles of the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, hoping to eventually revive a strong Polish state, which directly threatens Russian influence in the region. The emperor's expansionist projects towards the east irritate the Tsar, who sees them as an attempt to limit Russian power. In secret correspondences, Russian emissaries increasingly seriously consider forming a new coalition against France. The Austrian and Prussian governments, seemingly subservient to Napoleon, also harbor lingering grudges. Even though Prussia was defeated at the battles of Jena and Auerstedt, it is modernizing its army in the shadows. Austria, humiliated after the defeat of Austerlitz and several subsequent setbacks, remains cautious, but does not give up on regaining its place as a great power. All are waiting for a misstep by Napoleon to oppose him with a common force. The beginnings of a massive conflict are taking shape. Between the end of 1811 and the beginning of 1812, Napoleon assembles the Grand Army, a gigantic force of about 600,000 men. Never before in European history had such a concentration of soldiers been seen. They come not only from France, but also from Italy, Germany, via the Confederation of the Rhine, and Poland. This coalition of men under the emperor's command is preparing to cross the borders of the Russian Empire. On the Russian side, Alexander I and his generals anticipate the possibility of a French invasion, devising a retreat strategy. This is the famous scorched earth tactic, consisting of gradually retreating while destroying crops and evacuating populations in order to deprive the enemy of resources. In June 1812, Napoleon deems the time has come to force Alexander I back in line. According to his vision, a few decisive battles will suffice to crush the Russian armies, and the Tsar will have to submit again to the continental blockade. He is far from realizing that the vast geographic expanse of Russia, its harsh climate, and the determination of its people will pose formidable obstacles to his progress. On June 24, 1812, the Grand Army crosses the Niemen River, the natural border between the Grand Duchy of Warsaw and the Russian Empire. This date marks the official start of the invasion. Confident, Napoleon is said to have declared, while watching his soldiers cross the river, "The fate of the war lies there, beyond this river." Many officers think, like him, that the campaign will be short and victorious. The Russians, however, refuse to immediately engage in a pitched battle. They retreat inward, leaving behind burned villages and ravaged fields. The plan is to draw the Grand Army further and further into a vast space where French logistics will eventually falter. Logistics, precisely, is one of Napoleon's greatest challenges. Several 100,000 men need to be fed and equipped, as well as tens of thousands of horses for the cavalry and artillery. The poorly maintained Russian roads quickly become muddy due to rain, slowing down convoys. Scenes of discouragement unfold. Soldiers, sometimes belonging to Allied contingents less motivated than the French themselves, desert or scatter in search of food. Furthermore, the season is rainy, and many rivers are at flood stage, complicating crossings. Despite these difficulties, the Grande Armée advances in the hope of delivering a decisive battle. The French soldiers and their allies discover the harshness of the Russian campaigns, the remoteness of the towns, and the scarcity of resources. The local villagers have often already fled eastward, taking or burning their supplies. The French struggle to find sustenance. Officers must be ingenious to maintain discipline and order within the ranks. Desertions are on the rise, particularly among non-French troops, Italians, Germans, Swiss, or Poles, who are less invested than the Napoleonic veterans. Some dream of escaping the war and try to survive on their own in this vast forested area. Others, exhausted, die from diseases or accidents before even seeing a battlefield. Accounts report villages completely ravaged, both by the French army and by the Russians fleeing ahead of it. Not pushing through to Moscow is, above all, to rewrite the dramatic epilogue of the Russian campaign. In this rewriting, the immense fire of Moscow, the deserted city sabotaged by the Russians, no longer takes place. The Napoleonic troops thus do not witness the terrible sight of a spiritual capital in ruins, nor the strategic deadlock of a city devoid of all provisions. Instead, the emperor concentrates his forces in the north, where the proximity of the Baltic ensures a more secure supply line. In doing so, he avoids the logistical catastrophe and diplomatic deadlock that, in reality, saw Tsar Alexander I refuse any negotiation while the Kremlin, symbol of Tsarist power, delivered neither sustenance nor capitulation. In mid-July 1812, as the Grande Armée progresses through present-day Belarus, a crucial decision is being prepared at the top of the French command. After crossing the Niemen River 3 weeks earlier and occupying Vilnius, Napoleon's army has pushed further into Russian territory. Its vanguards are now approaching Vitebsk, a strategic city on the road to Smolensk and Moscow. At this precise moment, Napoleon observes the Russian strategy with frustration. No decisive battle is being offered to him. The enemy, under the command of Generals Barclay de Tolly and Bagration, is withdrawing its forces inland, burning villages and crops along its path. The French advance, but logistics become more complicated. The supply convoys stretch out, desertions increase, and the rain turns the roads into quagmires. It is at this strategic crossroads that Napoleon can still alter his initial plan. At Vitebsk, he has the opportunity not to push further toward Moscow and instead turn his campaign northward toward St. Petersburg. But in reality, instead of changing course, Napoleon presses on toward Smolensk, then Moscow, a choice that will seal the fate of the campaign. In choosing this strategic offensive toward the Baltic, Napoleon relies on several tactical considerations. Firstly, he gains a geographical advantage. St. Petersburg is significantly closer to the western border than Moscow, thereby considerably reducing the distance his troops will have to travel. Secondly, by controlling the coastline, he can receive food and ammunition from Prussia and German ports, without fearing the fatal logistical stretching already dreaded in the central plains of Russia. Finally, the capture of St. Petersburg directly threatens the prestige of the Romanov dynasty, as this city has remained, since the reign of Peter the Great, Russia's window to Europe. Lost to a foreign army, it would send a terrible signal of weakness throughout the Russian Empire, potentially hastening the sovereign's surrender. The new direction of the campaign is met with a mix of caution and relief among the French officers. Many of them, familiar with the severe reputation of Russian winters, fear an advance too deep into the heart of the steppe. Among Davout, Ney, Murat, and the other marshals, confidences are exchanged. It is better to march north, through territories where supply can be better managed thanks to the proximity of the sea. This approach also reassures the Allied contingents, notably Polish, Saxon, and Bavarian, who hope not to get trapped thousands of kilometers from their bases. They must, however, engage in combat along the northern route, where they already know that corps of the Russian army are ready. Indeed, Russian General Pyotr Kristianovich Wittgenstein is tasked with slowing the enemy's advance. Although he does not have forces comparable to the Grande Armée, he relies on his knowledge of the terrain, the patriotic fervor of his soldiers, and the possibility of using swamps and rivers to hinder the adversary. In this context, Marshal Louis-Nicolas Davout, one of Napoleon's most respected commanders for his rigor and determination, plays an essential role in the organization. He ensures that supply and ammunition convoys are not endangered by the Russian light cavalry, famous for its harassment operations. He sets up protective detachments and establishes an effective communication system with the lead columns. According to an anecdote reported by French officers, Davout repeatedly wrote orders at night, demanding that the field bakery and munitions wagons advance almost side by side, so that the soldiers would lack neither bread nor cartridges. His persistence in maintaining the logistics intact saves the troops from the dramatic famine that, in real history, decimated the ranks during the march to Moscow. The choice of the north proves to be advantageous. Despite the sometimes torrential rains of the Baltic summer, the French advance steadily. The skirmishes follow one after the other, forcing Wittgenstein to continue his retreat towards St. Petersburg. As July draws to a close, a certain feverishness grips the Russian capital. The elites residing there, accustomed to seeing war unfold far to the east or south, begin to fear the proximity of the confrontation. In aristocratic salons, it is whispered that Emperor Alexander is considering mobilizing the Imperial Guard to defend the city's suburbs, but many doubt the feasibility of a frontal battle, so formidable does the power of the Grande Armée appear. Among the population, strange stories are told about the Corsican ogre, a mocking nickname given to Napoleon by enemy propaganda. However, the actual arrival of French troops in the vicinity of the city causes a profound moral shock. Never has the heart of the Russian Empire been so directly threatened. People begin to carry jewels and valuable goods inland. Some even mention the possibility of evacuating the city, fearing this conflict may turn into a siege, with its toll of famine and destruction. Nothing, however, can prevent Napoleon's inexorable advance, determined to force Alexander to yield without exposing the Grande Armée to the traps of an early winter, where the cold often kills more than bullets. At the very beginning of August 1812, the first regiments of the Grande Armée finally see the towers and spires of St. Petersburg, nestled on the banks of the Neva. The Baroque and neoclassical architectural layering, once ordered by Peter the Great to make this city a European jewel, contrasts with the broad river spaces and multiple canals. Access to the capital by land is difficult. Fortifications, developed over the years, protect the key bridges. The Russians, aware of the strategic vulnerability of their metropolis, have tried to reinforce the local garrison, but have not been able to match the force of the French. Under the direction of Marshals Davout and Ney, the Grande Armée proceeds to progressively encircle St. Petersburg. Artillery is set up, aiming at the city's main gates. The Russian fleet, stationed in the port, cannot engage in real combat on the Neva, as it lacks warships suited to a large-scale confrontation against an enemy possessing formidable land batteries. The Russian military factions, poorly coordinated, seek above all to avoid the city being heavily bombarded. Alexander V, informed of the turn of events, knows that he cannot hold this siege for long, as food stocks risk being depleted in the event of prolonged isolation. But ordering capitulation without fighting would have major political consequences. The Russian emperor fears being judged guilty of having abandoned the capital of his ancestor Peter the Great without even trying to defend it. To save time, a few battles break out outside the walls. The hastily formed Russian regiments put up a courageous resistance, but the proven discipline of the Grande Armée eventually prevails. The French cannons, well positioned on the heights, pierce the defense lines. Napoleon, who has set up his headquarters several kilometers from the city to observe the progress of the front, receives regular detailed reports from his marshals. He does not wish to destroy St. Petersburg, a true gem of European architecture, as his goal is not ruin, but political constraint on Alexander I. This nuance is crucial. He thus leaves the possibility of an honorable surrender, provided that the Russians agree to negotiate his peace treaty immediately. The siege, though spectacular, actually proves to be of short duration. The Russians, caught off guard by the speed of the French offensive, have not been able to mobilize enough soldiers in the region. Moreover, the weakness of the communication routes increases the city's isolation. The meager reinforcements that could have come from Moscow or other governorates are diverted by the threat of French incursions into neighboring provinces. The morale of the urban population wavers. There is a fear of an impending famine if supply lines are cut. Prices of basic goods skyrocket. Despite some orchestrated distributions by the Russian army to maintain calm, the worry increases. Meanwhile, the logistical situation for the French is significantly more favorable than what the Grande Armée experienced on the way to Moscow. Taking advantage of the proximity to the Baltic Sea, the French receive supplies without much difficulty, shipped from Danzig or Königsberg. Allied merchant ships land in Baltic ports controlled by imperial troops, bringing flour, salted meat, and even some luxury products. Thus, while the siege is being established, a certain comfort reigns in the French camp. The soldiers speak proudly of the imminent capture of the Pearl of the North. An anecdote reported by officers narrates that, from Danzig, a boat carrying crates of chocolate and wine was dispatched to supply the officers' mess. Upon their arrival in St. Petersburg, these crates aroused the curiosity of the local population, unaccustomed to these products in the midst of war. This scene illustrates the enormous contrast between the relative abundance of the invading army and the hardships faced by the Russian defenders. Although the population fears the worst, the time has not yet come for mass exodus. Rumor has it that Emperor Alexander has left the city to take refuge in Novgorod, further south, taking a good part of the court with him. This flight creates a command vacuum, which generals remaining on site try to fill, but their efforts prove fruitless. The The bourgeois quarters of the city begin to raise barricades, not to fight directly, but to protect themselves from potential looters in case of local authorities' collapse. Some officials, loyal to the Tsar, want to continue the resistance, while others seek to negotiate an agreement with the French assailant. On August 15, 1812, the Grande Armée tightens its grip. Davout, ever meticulous, positions the line infantry and siege artillery within range of the ramparts. Well-targeted cannon shots destroy several strategic points, cutting off the water supply to parts of the city. Panic grows within the Russian garrison. The local bishop, pressed by the civilians' distress, urges the military authorities to find a quick solution to avoid a massacre in the ruin of the city's sanctuary, the Cathedral of Saints Peter and Paul, where the sovereigns of Russia rest. Despite a surge of patriotism, the outcome seems inevitable. The French firepower is superior, and the Russians have no prospect of immediate reinforcement. The surrender becomes a matter of time. On August 20th, 1812, the French headquarters sends an emissary to the ramparts to demand a clear response. The local Russian commander requests a temporary suspension of hostilities to consult his superiors. The improvised war council concludes in a few hours. It is decided that further fighting would lead to unnecessary bloodshed. On August 22nd, a white flag appears atop one of the towers overlooking the Neva. The cannons fall silent. In a silence loaded with emotion, the gates open to Napoleon's imperial army. The siege ends quicker than the most optimistic French officers would have imagined. Alexander III, the emperor, realizes the situation is deteriorating rapidly after the fall of St. Petersburg. Forced to flee the capital, he first takes refuge in Novgorod, a historic city halfway to Moscow, and then continues his retreat to avoid capture. The Russian lines are in disarray. The nobility, distanced from its center of power, fears that the empire will ignite into civil war. Rumors circulate that radical nationalists wish to offer the crown to another member of the dynasty deemed more capable of defending the homeland. Aware of the peril, Alexander hesitates. Should he try to rally the remaining army for a desperate battle before Moscow, or should he yield to French demands to avoid complete devastation of the country? Napoleon, as a calculating victor, issues an ultimatum. In a solemn message, he informs the Tsar that he has only two options: immediately negotiate peace or risk, seeing St. Petersburg, and perhaps other cities, suffer the hardships of occupation. The French diplomacy, embodied by marshals and political advisors skilled in post-battle negotiations, argues that the French Empire's goal is not to destroy Russia, but to subject it to the continental order and force it to comply with the blockade against England. For Alexander I, the dilemma is even more painful since he had been linked to Napoleon since the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807, when the two sovereigns had formed a nascent alliance. However, the independence of action he had then enjoyed had eroded over the years, and the capture of St. Petersburg pushed it to oblivion. In early September 1812, envoys crossed the lines. On behalf of the Russian emperor, they request talks to discuss a negotiated surrender. Napoleon, settled in a palace on the outskirts of St. Petersburg, immediately organizes a meeting. The date is not chosen at random. On September 7th, he consents to a local truce to allow Alexander's diplomats to gather. In the salons now under French control, preparations for the surrender ceremony are underway. The solemnity of the moment is evident. This act will be a major historical turning point, likely to reshape the map of Europe. When the negotiators finally meet Napoleon, they find a confident man eager to conclude. The conditions imposed by the Emperor of the French are severe: the formal recognition of a Franco-Russian empire under his tutelage, acceptance of the continental blockade against England, the preservation and expansion of the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, and the guarantee of special rights for the Poles who joined the Grande Armée. In other words, Russia finds itself forced to cede some of its influence in Central Europe and align with the principles defended by Napoleon. In the corridors, Russian diplomats lament these terms, but acknowledge they have little alternative. The continuity of the Romanov dynasty depends on the French emperor's clemency. On September 10, 1812, under French pressure, Alexander I, already weakened by the failure to defend his capital, agrees to ratify the treaty. He sends the representatives of Napoleon a message indicating his agreement in principle. The news soon spreads like a wildfire in European diplomatic circles. The powerful Russia, hitherto considered the hardest bulwark to overcome, has just yielded. The details of the agreement are yet to be finalized, but the capitulation is no longer a secret. In everyone's mind, the terms set by France represent a considerable humiliation for Russian pride, which will have to adapt to the status of a subordinate partner. To officially mark this capitulation, a ceremony is organized on September 14, 1812, in one of the rooms of the Winter Palace. Ironically, this emblematic palace, once the favorite residence of Elizabeth I and Catherine II, now witnesses the signing of the Russian Empire's submission. A handful of Russian dignitaries, surrounded by French generals in full uniform, attend the event. It is said that several Russian officers, heads held high but with somber looks, attempt to save face by assuring that it is only a strategic truce. Yet, the terms of the document clearly reflect Napoleon's dominance over this part of the continent. The official text, written in both languages, recalls the role of Alexander I as Tsar of Russia, but specifies that the defense of common interests will henceforth be placed under the aegis of the Emperor of the French. To seal this forced agreement, the two eagles are placed in the throne room: the French imperial eagle, symbol of the Napoleonic regime, and the Russian double-headed eagle. The rapprochement of these two emblems, previously opposed, embodies the fusion of authority that Napoleon wishes to establish. The establishment of a dual administration constitutes one of the pillars of this unprecedented alliance. Officially, Alexander I, Emperor of Russia, retains his title and legitimacy over all his territories. The Russian ministers, accustomed to the workings of the court, also keep their functions to avoid further unsettling the local nobility. However, these same ministers now find themselves closely monitored by French commissioners, or representatives, appointed by Napoleon himself. The objective of these controllers is clear: to ensure that the administrative reforms decreed by the Emperor of the French are implemented without delay within the vast Russian Empire. This close control is formalized by the creation of a joint imperial council. This institution, unprecedented in Europe, brings together both French dignitaries, including some marshals and high-ranking officials, and Russian aristocrats from the great families of St. Petersburg and Moscow. Ultimately presided over by Napoleon, this council deliberates on all the major orientations of the Franco-Russian Empire: finances, army, diplomacy, trade, etc. The few times Alexander III tries to use all his weight to protect Russian autonomy, his efforts are met with Napoleon's determination, always ready to impose his vision. To many foreign observers, this new structure suggests a half-hearted collaboration, where Russia remains officially sovereign, but finds itself, in reality, under the tutelage of Paris. In order to reinforce this tutelage and ensure the continuity of the Bonapartist dynasty, Napoleon quickly considers betrothing his son, the King of Rome, born in 1811 and officially named Napoleon François Charles-Joseph Bonaparte, to a princess from the Russian imperial family. The choice of such a dynastic alliance meets several imperatives. Firstly, it would give the young Bonaparte family increased legitimacy in the eyes of the Russian elites, still ambivalent about French domination. Secondly, it would guarantee the symbolic fusion of the two empires, since the future sovereign, the union's offspring between the Bonapartes and the Romanovs, would embody the continuity of the Franco-Russian project. Although this matrimonial rapprochement is not yet sealed at the very beginning of 1813, it already feeds vast speculations in the courts of Europe, where there are queries about the diplomatic consequences of this princely union. On his side, Alexander III remains Tsar in the eyes of his people, but his room for maneuver is considerably reduced. His advisors worry about the exacerbated role that France now plays in Russia's political and economic strategy. Important decisions, whether appointing a new provincial governor or opening a shipyard on the Black Sea, can no longer be made without the approval of the Joint Imperial Council and thus of Napoleon. Some members of the Russian nobility, to maintain favor, actively align themselves with the French, thereby offering their support to the new administration. Meanwhile, others, more suspicious, are already nurturing the hope of a long-term revenge should the French forces find themselves weakened. Napoleon's seduction of the Russian aristocracy is nonetheless a priority for the Corsican emperor. To ensure the stability of the regime, he distributes titles and rewards to certain influential boyars. The French generals, on the other hand, receive decorations that testify to their supposed exploits in the capture of St. Petersburg. Concerts, gala dinners, and other social events multiply. Napoleon understands that pomp and splendor are essential elements to rallying a part of the nobility. In this context, a curious phenomenon occurs. French officers discover the almost legendary opulence of Russian palaces, where gold, porcelain, and precious stones adorn the walls and buffets with disconcerting extravagance. Many accounts report that during sumptuous balls, French and Russian military personnel mingle in the dance, enjoying the pleasures of a momentary decrease in tensions. Some officers, moreover, speak with surprise of traditional Russian music, the grand orchestras of St. Petersburg, and the local cuisine, which they find both exotic and refined. This anecdote perfectly illustrates Napoleon's intent to make his men adopt a respect and fascination for Russian culture in order to better consolidate the new imperial union. As the institutions of the Franco-Russian Empire begin to take shape, it is Great Britain that becomes Napoleon's main strategic target. From his diplomatic victory over Alexander III in late 1812, the French emperor decides to excessively reinforce the continental blockade, a system designed to strangle the British economy by closing all continental ports to it. Now, with Russia firmly allied, Great Britain immediately loses a considerable market for its manufactured products and raw material exchanges. The Russians, under duress, almost totally cease importing British textiles and metal products, dealing a severe blow to the UK's trade balance. This tightening of the blockade concretely results in a tightening of customs control in the Baltic. The ports of St. Petersburg or Riga, once ambivalent, comply with French supervision. Imperial commissioners verify, control, and, if necessary, confiscate cargo suspected of having transited on English ships. Maritime patrols consisting of Russian and French vessels scour the Baltic Sea to prevent the arrival of smugglers. Certainly, there remains a share of illicit trade, notably through neutral ships or under false flags, but the route proves increasingly perilous for anyone wishing to unload British goods on continental Europe. The impact is felt immediately. Sweden, Denmark, and even Austria, which had shown a certain independence from Napoleon's orders, have no choice. Without the potential support of a Russia unbound by commitments, they fear the combined reprisals of France and the Russian Empire, even more violent military campaigns, prolonged occupations, or dismantling of their political structures. This is the show of force Napoleon wanted to establish. Now, the entire continental Europe, from the Atlantic to the Volga, is obligated to him in one way or another. In London, the reaction is both combative and tinged with anxiety. Caricatures appear in the press, depicting Napoleon disguised as a Russian bear holding a muzzled Alexander I in his claws. The English public, already accustomed to this type of critique of the French emperor, nonetheless discovers a new tone: the fear of a Franco-Russian empire that could, in the long term, bring the United Kingdom to its knees. Debates in Parliament become acrimonious. Some lawmakers, mostly from merchant circles, propose seeking a compromise with Napoleon to safeguard what remains of their continental interests. Others, more uncompromising, refuse any negotiations with the one they consider a usurping dictator, arguing that British naval superiority and its distant colonies will eventually prevail. Nevertheless, the economic crisis is beginning to affect the British population. The scarcity of opportunities and the decline in exports lead to factory closures, rising unemployment, and soaring prices. In major industrial cities like Manchester, Liverpool, or Birmingham, workers protest. Sporadic disturbances erupt, firmly suppressed. The Royal Navy remains powerful and still controls maritime routes to India or America. But each day, the effects of the continental blockade become more painful. The British government, divided on the strategy to adopt, struggles to find common ground to fight effectively against the immense power of Napoleon, now backed by Russia. At the turn of 1813, the new Franco-Russian configuration unfolds across the continental stage. Through the treaty sealing their alliance, the two emperors redraw geopolitical balances. The Confederation of the Rhine, an entity created by Napoleon in 1806 to replace the former Holy Roman Empire, finds itself strengthened. It welcomes more small German states, forced to join this bloc under the threat of sanctions. Meanwhile, in the east, Russia forms with Poland, which has become the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, expanded thanks to French support, a sort of second ring of influence. Caught in a pincer, proud Prussia negotiates its survival. It sees its room for maneuver reduced, unable to resist simultaneously the Western pressure from France and the Eastern threat from Russia. Among the great powers, Austria finds itself the most concerned by this new deal. Already linked to Napoleon through his marriage to Archduchess Marie-Louise in 1810, Vienna has no choice but to cope with the relentless advance of Napoleon's policy. The Habsburgs, keen to preserve their prestige, strive to maintain a semblance of sovereignty, but must submit to orders emanating from Paris and St. Petersburg. To maintain peace on Austrian soil, they agree to introduce French and Russian troops on their territories, supposedly to deter any local rebellion or British intrusion. This omnipresent surveillance is entrusted to the services of Joseph Fouché's secret police, a figure who has become one of the most feared men of the imperial regime. Skillful, manipulative, and fully aware of the danger posed by plots, Fouché now collaborates with Russian officers mandated by Alexander Tharp, under Napoleon's influence, to root out any signs of uprising. The police network extends: interception of mail, informant listening, infiltration into anti-French aristocratic circles. Anyone who dares to criticize the emperor risks life imprisonment or forced exile. It is in this climate of fear that, for example, in Berlin, clandestine pamphlets circulate discreetly, comparing Napoleon to a new Genghis Khan, come to subjugate peoples. Repression is swift. Several publishers are arrested, and the imperial army ensures an example is made by multiplying symbolic actions, such as burning depots suspected of spreading subversive papers. Diplomatic alliances are mostly forged under France's pressure. The small Italian states, the Kingdom of Italy under Beauharnais, Tuscany, or Naples, governed by Joachim Murat, Switzerland and the Dutch provinces find themselves compelled to follow, to the letter, the instructions dictated by the emperor. Some, already under direct French administration, eventually submit without much resistance, given the massive Napoleonic military presence. Others, tempted to negotiate secretly with Great Britain, quickly remember that the ocean, and the navy, will not protect them from potential terrestrial reprisals. Diplomats from these regions speak of an imposed peace climate, more feared than desired, which many ironically nickname the Pax Napoleonica. This term, modeled after the Pax Romana, is repeated in Europe to highlight the immense coercive power now exercised by Napoleon, supported by the former Tsar enemy turned ally. The period from 1814 to 1816 marks the peak of what might be called integrated Franco-Russian power. Having subdued almost all of continental Europe, controlled trade through the blockade, and silenced major dissidences, Napoleon can now fully exploit the resources of the vast territory partially allotted to him. From an economic standpoint, the almost total control of continental Europe allows France to establish a genuine monopoly over certain strategic sectors. The main goal remains the commercial suffocation of Great Britain, but in reality, internal exchanges within the empire reach unprecedented proportions. Russia, vast and expansive, provides abundant raw materials, wood, furs, hemp for the navy, and especially large quantities of wheat or rye needed to feed the population and the armies. France, on its side, specializes in nascent industrial production, arms manufacturing, textiles, ironworks, thanks to a massive influx of capital. The emperor encourages accelerated industrialization, seeing in this complementarity a means to definitively surpass the British economic model. Building on these successes on the continent, Napoleon turns once more to overseas prospects. Since the American War of Independence and the setbacks suffered against the British in the Indian Ocean, France had lost a great deal of its overseas influence. But the new emperor, convinced that his still nascent fleet could be reorganized, aims to re-establish a significant presence in India, which was once partially French before the Treaty of Paris in 1763. This strategic goal is paired with a project to reconquer Egypt, where he had campaigned in 1798. Seizing Cairo and Alexandria would mean controlling the trade route to the east and directly threatening British positions in the region. With the same spirit of expansion, Russia, now an associate of France, does not intend to stay in the background. It closely monitors Central Asia, an area where the Russians had already begun making inroads before the Tatar reconquest in previous years. The Tsarist forces, supported by French logistical expertise and the progressive modernization of their infrastructures, consider extending their influence to Persia, modern-day Iran, and even eyeing Afghanistan. Diplomats of the Franco-Russian Empire increasingly seek to establish trading posts in these regions to consolidate overland trade routes, potentially challenging maritime traffic dominated by the Royal Navy. An anecdote, reported by some naval officers, mentions a French explorer who set out with the support of the Joint Imperial Council towards eastern Siberia. There, he allegedly allied with local merchants to pave the way for silk trade, with raw materials coming from plantations further south, then transiting to Europe via a secure overland network. This still tentative project nonetheless symbolizes Napoleon's desire to bypass dependency on maritime routes that Great Britain seeks to dominate. A Franco-Russian Silk Road, stretching from the far east of Asia to Paris, would challenge British commercial hegemony and bolster the reputation of a geopolitical entity spanning nearly the entire length of Eurasia. Despite the strength of the Royal Navy, England thus finds itself in difficulty. Its many colonies help maintain a degree of prosperity, but the almost hermetic closure of the European market prevents it from effectively selling its manufactured products. London can still offload its textiles and industrial innovations to Canada, Australia, or India, but the most direct profits, once reaped through trade with nearby Europe, drastically diminish. Tax revenues are no longer sufficient to cover the expenses incurred in protecting such an extensive colonial empire, and internal dissent is rising among merchants and workers. The rise in prices, fueled by the need to import basic goods from overseas that can no longer transit through continental Europe, exacerbates social discontent. In several major British cities, reports emerged from 1814 of worker protests denouncing stagnant wages and the high cost of living. Army and police patrols are reinforced, and Her Majesty's government struggles to propose concrete solutions, torn between the desire to continue the relentless war against Napoleon and the temptation to negotiate a compromise. The diplomatic pressure exerted by France and Russia, united into the same imperial entity, becomes a daily occurrence. Franco-Russian squadrons in the North Sea watch for the slightest breach in British naval defense, while Parisian and St. Petersburg emissaries urge neutrals, particularly in the Americas, to steer clear of English merchant convoys. Revolutionaries in Latin America, although distant but informed of global tensions, observed the evolution of the Franco-Russian Empire with caution. Simón Bolívar, for instance, seeks foreign support to consolidate the independence of various South American regions. If Napoleonic France wished to weaken Spain, which remained subjugated, by launching fleets towards the Caribbean, it would be the Royal Navy that would stand in its way. In the background, the question of global balance has never seemed so unstable. A single alliance, improbably forged in St. Petersburg, has managed to reshape the map and dictate its laws to millions of subjects. A symbol of this rising power, the economy planned by Napoleon and revitalized by Russian territorial expansion could, in the long term, provide a solid foundation for the development of an early heavy industry and the emergence of unprecedented means of transportation. From 1835 onwards, the Franco-Russian Empire, long propelled by Napoleon's inexhaustible energy, enters a phase of uncertain consolidation. The emperor, born in 1769, is now 66 years old, and time's marks are visible on his body. Although his intellect remains sharp, his face has become gaunt, his hair has whitened, and the long campaigns he led have left their mark on his health. Once capable of simultaneously directing the army, administration, and diplomacy, he begins to gradually delegate the government of this vast territory to his marshals as well as Russian advisors. The latter, once chosen for their unconditional loyalty, see their influence grow in the void left by the exhausted emperor. Their rivalry soon surfaces. Each claims to capture Napoleon's trust and promotes their own priorities for the empire. Meanwhile, Alexander I, or the person who would have succeeded him if the Tsar has already deceased according to some sources, stays away from crucial decisions. Officially, he remains Napoleon's partner in conducting affairs, but the Russian court, frustrated by his submission since the capitulation of 1812, dreams of emancipation. In this subtle balance game, the first cracks can be seen in a structure that, until then, appeared unshakable. Alexander I's role, if he is still on the throne, has gradually weakened over the years. Increasingly inclined to retire to his palaces outside St. Petersburg, he leaves daily administration to ministers weary of French interference. Many of them, while displaying a facade of loyalty to Napoleon, secretly plot to restore a purely Russian internal order. French advisors distrust them and keep a close watch on these ministers, but they struggle to understand the nuances of local politics. Napoleon, aware of the growing threats, tries to maintain the illusion of a fraternity of arms with Russia. He occasionally organizes receptions, constantly recalls the alliance sealed at the time of the 1812 capitulation, and pretends not to notice that, in many Russian salons, paths are being paved for a questioning of the imperial pact. Yet, this already precarious balance holds only because Napoleon's personality remains a tutelary force. He is the victor of so many battles, the architect of a new European order, and his aura remains strong. But this aura is gradually faltering. Courtiers notice his persistent coughing fits, his fatigue during military parades, and his increasing difficulty moving around. According to his doctors, his health is no longer that of an invincible conqueror. Within the empire, weariness is growing in various regions that have been subjugated for nearly 3 decades. Poland, which was promised a privileged status by Napoleon, is still governed by half-French, half-Russian governors who stifle any inclination towards autonomy. Polish intellectuals revive the crucial question: why should we remain eternally caught between 2 conquering powers, rather than becoming masters of our own destiny? In Italy, the promise of a large, unified kingdom has never truly materialized. Italian provinces are segmented, dominated by princes subjugated to the emperor. As for the German states, gathered within the Confederation of the Rhine, they are still under tight Franco-Russian control, and their princes dream of an independence that has been confiscated for too long. To contain these tremors of revolt, the emperor persists in a repressive policy he believes necessary to safeguard peace and stability. Press censorship is strengthened. Any open criticism of the regime is subject to arrest. In cities like Warsaw, Milan, or Hamburg, military patrols roam the streets to prevent any suspicious gatherings. French prefects, assisted by officers of the Imperial Gendarmerie, organize nocturnal raids to nip opposition in the bud. State secrecy takes precedence over freedom. Arrests are made on mere suspicion. These measures, which might have seemed necessary in wartime, fuel growing resentment among the population. Foreign diplomats comment on this headlong rush. Napoleon, once celebrated for his civil code and institutional modernization, increasingly appears as an authoritarian ruler, attempting at all costs to preserve a sprawling empire. This drift only encourages local notables to murmur, "What will happen when Napoleon is no longer here?" Outside, Great Britain remains watchful, heavily economically weakened by the continental blockade, which has continued for years. It has turned inward, consolidating its colonial empire. Its impressive Royal Navy continues to roam the seas of the globe, preserving access to raw materials from Asia and Africa. The British have never forgiven the French domination over the European continent, and many see in the deterioration of Napoleon's health an upcoming opportunity. In the London Parliament, voices are raised demanding funds to support continental revolts. Some even hope for a strong landing on the North Sea coasts at the critical moment. For now, British officials remain cautious. The Franco-Russian Empire remains formidable, and a mere mistaken judgment could provoke a brutal response from Napoleon. But the idea is gaining ground that a simultaneous uprising in Poland, Italy, and Germany, supported by a British naval intervention, could finally crack the hegemony imposed by the Franco-Russian coalition. Nevertheless, it is a more brutal event that will hasten the sequel, the death of Napoleon, occurring in the early 1840s. Accounts vary on the precise cause, gastric disease or renal complication. Be that as it may, the announcement of his death shakes this bicameral empire. On the very morning of the news, mourning is proclaimed in Paris, where the population gathers in front of the Tuileries to mourn the great man who had made and unmade so many kingdoms. In St. Petersburg, though mourning wreaths are placed on the doors of the imperial palaces, the sadness is more subdued. In Russian noble circles, some see it almost as a message from destiny. Finally, the French tutelage will weaken, whisper the courtiers, now watching for the reaction of Tsar Alexander I or his successor. Whatever is said, the figure of Napoleon fades away, and with it disappears the main cement of imperial cohesion. The succession rightfully falls to the King of Rome, Napoleon's son, who will quickly be given the title of Napoleon II. However, this young sovereign lacks the stature and experience of his father. Raised with the principles of a vast empire, nurtured in the cult of an almost legendary man, he suddenly discovers the magnitude of a charge he has never exercised. The French, very attached to the dynasty, nevertheless insist that the transition be handled with a certain dignity. They hope that the coronation of the new emperor will preserve the empire's integrity and defend the gains of the revolution. But in a context where Russia becomes more hostile, where annexed territories rumble, the challenges seem insurmountable. Napoleon II is regarded with circumspection by his own marshals, who, behind the scenes, wonder if it might be wiser to negotiate separate agreements with local powers to avoid a general conflagration. The young monarch himself fears betrayal and surrounds himself with zealous courtiers whose competence is far from matching their ambition. The question then arises as to where Napoleon II should reign. Should he settle in Paris, at the heart of French imperial tradition, or relocate to St. Petersburg, the seat of the Russian monarchy and nominal capital of his ally? Politically, this alternative is thorny. If he chooses France, he risks wounding Russia's pride, which would feel relegated to the background, especially since there is still a Tsar in place, or a direct successor of Alexander I. If he opts for St. Petersburg, he cuts himself off from parts of the French elite who would see this choice as a complete abandonment of the empire's foundations. Quietly, some suggest he alternates travel between the two capitals, but the idea seems unrealistic. How can one effectively govern such an extensive territory while constantly navigating between the West and Russia? At the risk of weakening everything, a choice must be made. The decision lingers, and each day of hesitation increases uncertainty in the provinces. Meanwhile, if Alexander III is still alive, the scope of his authority remains ambiguous. Aged and less influential than before, he can still count on the support of an aristocracy irritated by the French omnipresence. Some nobles dream of reducing the influence of Napoleon II to only an honorary title, while returning full sovereignty to Russia. If Alexander III has been replaced by another Tsar, such as Nicholas I, the dynamics could prove even more disastrous for the young French emperor. An energetic leader at the helm of Russia would see this as an unexpected opportunity to gain independence. Once silent, Russian ministers openly propose a re-examination of the treaties that sealed the alliance. They threaten to sever all diplomatic ties if France does not grant more autonomy to Russia. In this climate, the symbolic boundary between the two halves of the empire expands. It gradually becomes clear that the cohesion imposed by Napoleon will not withstand the shocks of realpolitik. In parallel, in Italy, Germany, and Poland, the apparent passivity of the early years transforms into much more difficult agitation to contain. Italian secret societies, like the Carbonari, sense that the time has come to overthrow the established order and reform the peninsular states into a single kingdom, free from Franco-Russian tutelage. In Poland, patriotic officers, tired of acting as intermediaries between two empires, prepare an insurrection. They hope for support from part of the local nobility, and above all, watch for any sign of British external backing. In the German states, the Confederation of the Rhine has failed to meet the aspirations of German unity. Intellectuals and students organize clandestine gatherings to extol shared freedom, culture, and language. Illegal pamphlets are printed, urging a break with the bicameral empire, stigmatizing the oppression of a regime held only by an inexperienced leader. From London, this spectacle is observed with growing interest. Although the island has suffered greatly from the closure of continental markets, the British Navy remains unparalleled. Rumors suggest warships ready to set sail from southern English ports should simultaneous insurrections weaken Napoleon II's empire. English political circles are torn between proponents of a diplomatic solution, trying to negotiate a lasting peace with a young, potentially more malleable ruler, and those who wish to directly dismantle the Napoleonic construction. There is no shortage of pretexts. Defending the rights of peoples oppressed by the Franco-Russian dictatorship could justify a possible intervention, at least in front of British public opinion. Massive investments are made to equip the arsenals of Portsmouth, Plymouth, or Chatham, so that by the late 1830s, the Royal Navy is more ready than ever to engage in a showdown if given the opportunity. Faced with these challenges, Napoleon II must decide. He hesitates between two paths, repression or conciliation. If he chooses brutal repression, he risks alienating the conquered peoples permanently and provoking even more violent uprisings, potentially supported by the United Kingdom. Furthermore, Russia could use it as a pretext to denounce the alliance, claiming to want to protect the Orthodox or Slavic populations in rebellion. If he attempts conciliation, he will have to make major concessions, extended autonomy for Poland, a promise of Italian reunification, or even the dissolution of the Confederation of the Rhine in favor of some form of German federal state. But such concessions would prove perilous for imperial cohesion without any guarantee that his authority would remain intact. As the weeks pass, the young sovereign, advised by opportunists and veterans of the Napoleonic era, finds himself at an impasse. Domestic fears grow. A wrong move could trigger an avalanche of secessions. Eventually, the empire weakens to the point that collapse becomes inevitable in the years that follow. Insurrections erupt successively. In Poland, a revolt led by nationalist officers proclaims a provisional government in 1846. Immediately, France sends regiments to restore order, while Moscow threatens to intervene militarily in turn to protect its former protégés. In Italy, in the northern states, the Carbonari seize important cities like Milan, declaring the creation of an autonomous Italian league. In Berlin and Munich, popular riots break out, overthrowing governors subjugated to the empire. The French marshals, overwhelmed, attempt to quell these revolts on several fronts simultaneously, but the logistics quickly prove inadequate. Without Napoleon's nearly obsessive organization, the imperial machine struggles to synchronize its forces. It is then that Russia, sensing the opportunity to regain its complete freedom, breaks the agreement with Napoleon II and begins its gradual withdrawal from the bicameral pact. The Russian troops, stationed in certain border regions, received the order to withdraw and secure their own borders, leaving France to struggle alone. The United Kingdom, for its part, openly supports some independence movements by supplying them with arms and funds in the hope of permanently fracturing Napoleonic hegemony on the continent. Under the joint pressure of these internal uprisings and this external harassment, the empire, long invincible, unravels at a bewildering speed. The formerly subjected regions, one after another, proclaim their secession, while in Paris, Napoleon II clings to an increasingly abstract power. In a few months, the bicameral edifice cracks, and a multitude of small states are reborn or reconstituted according to national logics. Russia, finally free from the constraining pact, redefines its own expansionist policy, sometimes by supporting the emergence of buffer kingdoms, sometimes by negotiating with London to reaffirm its ambitions in the East. The last faithful of the Napoleonic dynasty mourn a dream of unity that ends in chaos. Thus, the disappearance of the political giant that was Napoleon III was enough to make the largest entity in Europe falter. In the short term, the empire survived thanks to the solid military and administrative legacy left by its founder, but in the medium or long term, the centrifugal forces, exacerbated by British hostility and Russian distrust, demonstrated their destructive power. The most likely scenario thus leads to a general collapse of this bicameral construction. Proof that even the most colossal of empires cannot endure without the firm grip and extraordinary charisma of its creator.